Hi, folks. Thank you for joining us during your lunch hour. My name is Aaron Snow. I am a fellow at the Georgetown University Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation. In my previous work, I ran a team called 18F inside the US government, a digital team that you've heard a little bit about earlier today, and then spent a few years running the Canadian Digital Service up in Ottawa. I am very, very happy and privileged to introduce you today to two members of the team from the Center for Digital Public Infrastructure from halfway around the world, literally. Pramod Varma is co-chair of CDPI and also chief architect of many of India's most significant digital accomplishments, including their digital ID system and the India Stack. Kamya Chandra is the chief strategy officer for CDPI and an advisor to the finance minister in India. And I want to start, first of all, thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure to be here. Yeah.
And I want to start by just asking the basic question. When we say digital public infrastructure, this is a relatively new buzzword or buzz phrase. What do we mean? Is it the same as government as a platform? Is it something different? And what are some examples of DPI?
Yeah, I think it's a great start. I think we created this vocabulary called digital public infrastructure last year during the G20 conversations. But the idea existed. I think even you talked about reusability, you talked about shared infrastructure, shared systems, so that every department or every government center or banks don't have to recreate again and again, and a bunch of things. So I think the concept existed for a while. I mean, and it's not that, and much of that is inspired by what internet is. Internet is the original DPI. You know, it's a public good. It's really a common, driven by standards and protocols, and then private innovation is thriving, right? So the way you want to think about is that we build physical infrastructure as a shared good for the society, like highways and airports and libraries and so on. And it's a very common thing for us to say. Of course, when we build a new community, we will build shared infrastructure. Nobody builds your own roads. Each company doesn't build their own road. But when it comes to software, it's notoriously common for everyone to build their own stuff again and again. I think it is to do with maybe practices, software practices, private companies wanting to make money, or whatever the reasons may be. Or it's just software is easy to write and fix it, so it's not that hard as physical infrastructure. So I think less thought has gone behind the idea of creating shared digital infrastructure, quite like physical infrastructure we would always do. And this is also to do with the fact that technology is led by technology companies, and they go way too fast. So when Silicon Valley goes really fast, it's hard for Washington to catch up, I think. That's what you can see that in all the time, right? So I think because of that, unlike the earlier era of industrial era, where we had decades to plan and execute, in the information era we compressed all that thing, and every 5 years things are changing too fast. So I think the methodology, the frameworks, and the economic impact studies of shared systems have not been as well done as in the physical infrastructure before. So I think people just tend to build your own. And it's like, I have my budget, I have my team. Why should I bother building something that is complex and collaborating? Collaborating is not easy in the government. So in India, though, let me give you the context, and Kamya can comment a little bit on that. India, we had no choice. I think the reason being, in 2009, India was less than 20% of Indians had bank account. Less than 20%. So you can imagine, that's like 15 years into the public internet. We already had smartphones, we had Android, we had iPhone, we had cloud computing, we had all the good stuff going on in the world, and India was still struggling to give bank account to people. I know there was no identity, there was no bank account, and Indians also very diverse. We spoke we speak different languages. The only common language is English between us. So 22 official languages, hundreds of languages. So cultural diversity, language diversity creates even more trouble for us. So I think India, when we started doing digital journey in 2009, it was starting to become clear that we cannot have everyone building an identity system, everyone trying to expensive way to create bank account, expensive way to service a financial loan, for example, to a small, medium business, and so on. Payments were, we had 22 million credit cards, 1.4 billion people. So think about it, okay? So 1 billion adults, 1.4 billion people, 22 million credit cards. So we had no penetration of whatsoever. I know that's very bad way to set up a society. So we directly went into a reuse game. So DPI is about that. DPI is about creating reusable assets, digital assets that can be leveraged by innovators, private innovators, public innovation, so that you don't have to keep rebuilding again and again. As simple as that.
Yeah. No, I think Pramod summarizes beautifully. I think just to add, the way that we frame it usually is that platforms will plateau, but networks will work. And the reason for that is because at the end of the day, one platform means that you have only the number of users that come to that platform. So if you frame sort of government as a platform, that's the only platform you can use. But if you think about us as digital citizens today, I mean, just on your mobile device, you probably have about 50 platforms that you're interacting with, right? And those 50 platforms are connected to a network probably of 500 or 5,000 suppliers and producers and input providers, right? So if Uber is a platform, then they have a network behind them of drivers, and they have a network of car maintenance facilities, and they have a network of riders. Now, can you think about, rather than just saying, what's the one platform I can build, which is equivalent as an app, right? What's the app I can build, which is today, the sexiest thing a government department can do is to try to push the next viral app. Instead, think about how you can influence all the apps on the Play Store and allow them to be interoperable, allow them to join a common network. That's what we mean by Rails, right? What we mean, since we have a technical audience here, I think we can say that when we say Rails, we mean publication of open specifications and open standards and open APIs that can be reused and reused among transactions that are business to business and have government nowhere in between. But because they're as per a common standard specified by the government, it allows for the government in that way to play a role of that highway, even though it's not present in the transaction.
So can you give an example or two? So, of course, the India story. You work with a handful of other countries right now, and an ever-expanding number of countries, to help them to roll out DPI in various contexts. Can you talk about the why these countries get interested and what you do with them, and what at one level you're helping install the plumbing for them, that foundational work, the infrastructure. But it probably rarely comes as just help us install the infrastructure. It's probably pretty use case driven. So you talk about a couple examples of that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I think at the Center for DPI, we're one of many organizations. We're not at all the only organization. Many organizations like the World Bank, UNDP, DIAL, many have been partnering for some time with governments to help support them in their digitization journey. And often, what we see is there's digital departments that are looking for digital for the sake of digital, and then you have social problem-oriented departments. There's like a health ministry or any kind of functional ministry that's looking to solve a problem and has no idea how digital can help them, right? Except for maybe some notion of like what an app or some website they can build or some registry. So I think the goal of technical assistance providers or advisory providers like us is to kind of go in and stitch those two together in a way to say, look, we know the problem you're trying to solve. The ultimate problem is not, so lack of scale up of a digital platform is not a societal problem, right? Societal problems are things like lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to education, lack of access to an employment subsidy that they need, right? The question is, how do you facilitate the delivery of those services through rails that are multi-purpose, multi-channel, multimodal, right? And therefore meet the needs of the whole population. So one example we'll give you is sort of, we're working with the government of Malawi, and they're thinking through to say, how can we deliver benefits to people after a cyclone, right? They get hit by those, especially post-climate risk world. They're worried about it. They don't know how to deliver it in an effective time when people may not have bank accounts, right? So you can't send money digitally if the person on the other end doesn't have a bank account. And so the first step was sort of UNDP worked with them over 10 years to create a verifiable identity as a verifiable credential that got in 12 million residents into that system. And then now we're working with them to build like a very light touch, what's called ID to account mapper, which helps to say, as an individual, I can go in and say, this is my ID number, I need to get benefits, and they don't need to give any other information, and that money can get routed to their mobile money account. They don't have to have a bank account because the digital infrastructure is fungible enough that it's not siloed into the banking network of an RTGS system. You can have any kind of payment mode linked on the other side, right? So that's just one example, but we work with 25 plus countries around the world on data sharing, credentials, mechanisms for dispersal of payments, peer-to-peer, peer-to-merchant, of course, identities and registries and so on. But the real thing that we see is that countries are really desperate around the world. I mean, the US probably included, right, to really build to serve their people. And there's a lot of sort of, in this space, I think there's particularly a lot of technocentrism to say, can I build the most cutting edge thing? And actually what we usually tell them is go simpler, go smaller, but have the next quick win and have user and product market fit before you try to scale, right? Excuse my honesty.
No, it's
probably
great.
yeah.
I speak for everyone in the room when I say it's great and refreshing. So India has states and municipalities. You're a multi-tiered government, the same as the U.S. And a lot of some of the work you did was nationally driven, national government mandated. There are forms of DPI that are not nationally driven and not nationally mandated.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you navigate when you have 15 states and thousands of municipalities and lots of folks in the private sector who want to provide solutions or be the solution? How do you navigate all that to the point where you have this openly defined DPI for use cases?
Or the scale effect. How do you get scale effect? Yeah. Because occasionally you get a good win, but how do you repeat this, in a systematic manner, right? So that's a good question as well. It's very tough. It's complex. Departments don't talk to departments, and turf wars and vendor takeover. So just everywhere. It's where what you see. That's the reality. Given that reality, we ask this question: are there components that are naturally fitting for a national portability? And identity is one example. Indians are very mobile because of the economic growth that's going on. So they move from 700,000 villages. They don't stay there. They come to urban places. But actually, when they move, they are sort of no one when they move to a new place because they can't speak the language, they can't identify themselves because it's like a continent, right? India is like a continent, although there's a country union come together for governance reasons. But otherwise, everything is different. So it's like Europe in that sense, right? So you travel, then you look like a different country. So it is important that some items like identity, payments, we drove a national agenda to allow portability, money, extensive, simple use of money. And I'll give you an example of these two projects. So identity project started in 2009 and 2010 we launched. And it is the most simplistic, and Kamya's point, the most minimalistic identity system in the world, I can actually say, because we have analyzed almost every ID system. And a few things reason. I think that extreme minimalism allowed success of rollout, because anything you complicate, very high chance you die in your own weight. in a software, IT projects, right? So you make it extremely simple. So simple that you have not, sort of win. But simplicity was, other than technology advantage, simplicity gave advantage of not walking into others' turf. For example, a health department would look at it and say, we have health ID, or we have driver's license, or we have banking ID and so on, tax ID and so on. Why should I take your ID? And that's also federal. Why should I take federal ID, right? The question was that, so the India's ID system is entitlement-free ID system. What does it mean? It doesn't even give you citizenship rights. It doesn't give you anything. It simply say, I am Pramod. That's it. Nothing more. And that simplicity allowed now the Department of Road Transport to say, anyway I have to give licenses. Anyway, the first step of license is to ask you who you are. And then make sure you can drive, right? The entitlement to drive, right? So everybody found this to be not an attacking their turf, only amplifying what they did. So the minimalism and as an advantage of being not only being successes of rollout, IT rollout, but it also actually doesn't come in the way of others' turf. The more attributes you add, more capabilities you build in your system, very high chance you're making somebody else unhappy. So it's very important to keep it simple. That worked really well. So ID and payments work that way. And ID went in from nobody having identity to 1 billion people having identity in 7 years. And we are 1.39 billion people have digital identity in the country today.
That was, by the way, the fastest to get to 7 years.
Even faster than WhatsApp.
Faster than WhatsApp, Microsoft, Amazon, or
yeah.
all of these.
Like at the speed of ChatGPT rollout, right? Yeah. But I think it's simplicity. I think the simplicity, and most importantly, I think the previous panel talked about it, putting user at the center.
Yeah.
We cannot have department view, government view to say, I want to fix this problem, I want to collect taxes, I want to clean up this thing, I want to do. What does people want? Half the time they want exactly opposite to what you want. So you have to really understand, why should people stand in line and support a project like this and say, I want my ID and it's going to benefit me. And women or everybody, gender parity is very key for us. So we successfully rolled that out, and then payment, second one. Those two, payment we launched in 2016, somewhat Fed now on steroids, think of that way. So Zelle is sort of an early version of it here. But that's what we did, and interoperability was the only norm. And you know what was that payment infrastructure was about? Not software, specifications. Tech guys will know. It is equivalent to an HTTP specification. It was 1.5 pages. That's it, just spec. But all banks were encouraged to adopt it. And if everybody adopted it, the network would be very, very powerful. Mm-hmm. And we gave incentivized. It was not mandated, by the way. Today we have, from 2016, today we have 350 banks connected to the network, many mobile wallet companies connected to the network, card companies connected to the network, and from no transaction in 2016, we ran 13.5 billion transactions last month. So this is really important to keep it extremely simple and incentive align the user. If users are incentive aligned, they will support. And when they support it, politicians love it. So this is a nice cycle to work. Otherwise, nobody knows why you're spending $1 billion or $500 million on an IT project to entertain whom, right? So it's very, very key. But your next question was, not everything is federal. You cannot do everything federal. When it came to health infrastructure, education infrastructure, it was completely a state subject. So at that time, we did not create a central infrastructure. We created reusable standards. So when the center gives education funding, they would say, for the sake of students and for the sake of teachers, make sure these standards, digital standards I'm talking about, not pedagogic standard. Digital standards are adopted, and that was tied to funding. I asked you before this, do you tie at least specification standards adoption as part of federal funding? That would be a good thing, good way to do. Because what we are saying is that what you should do, not how you should do. So you're saying that it is important because people don't care about boundaries. People care about opportunities. Opportunity to work, opportunity to trade, opportunity to interact, and opportunity to work with other people. And these boundaries are so artificial in the world today. It's weird. So we should not come in the way of that and empower people. And then we have the third track, where we create running infrastructure shared, or standards, or shared code base, which is open source code base, which we say, if you are a state, if you want to jumpstart before your next election, if you want to get your health up and running, healthcare, why do you start writing from scratch? We have Linux for you, open source for you. Maybe you want to use it. Maybe you want to use it. It's up to you. So that's the conversations.
So I'm going to ask one more question, but I want to make sure there's time for folks to ask. So if you're thinking of questions, start to think about that, and then we'll sort of see what kind of questions bubble up from the crowd. How do you ensure that the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure that you're creating, and it's worth emphasizing the word public, I suppose, in DPI. How do you make sure that it's inclusive and accessible and doesn't leave folks behind?
I'll let you answer this. Yeah, very good one.
Yeah, no, I think
especially for India.
Uh-huh.
Especially for India.
Yeah, exactly. I think around the world you have users, and even in the US, you still have people who don't have a smartphone. It's not like everyone in the country has a smartphone, right? And there's also a gender disparity often in access to smartphones and access to devices. Even if you own a phone, maybe it's a shared phone, right? You have language barriers, you have gender barriers, you have many sort of constructs that are preventing people from accessing services. So this goes back to the earlier point around a platform versus a network, because if you build a platform, you have to determine the user interface. And usually the user interface you pick is the one that targets the most educated, elite part of society, the one that can access an app on a mobile device, or go into a website and they have internet connectivity and they can log in using their laptop and can remember their password. And this is all a set of assumptions that you're making. The powerful design principle behind digital public infrastructure is to only specify the infra and not the user experience. So if you look at, for example, the payments infrastructure that Pramod referred to, you can initiate a payment on the unified payment interface through a smartphone app, and there you can choose any app. So it's not like if somebody else has Zelle, you have to have Zelle. It's the equivalent of you can have a Venmo, they can have a Zelle, and you can pay them interoperably, right? But beyond that, you can make a payment using a feature phone if you don't have a smartphone. Most of us might have forgotten what those look like, but it's the old, the Panasonic, Nokia, devices that just have the numbers on them. You can just raise a call, use and over USSD, IVR, you can make a payment and initiate it and enter your PIN, right? And you can also do it in an assisted mode without a phone at all, to walk in to an agent who has a device, and you can initiate the payment, for example, using your biometrics.
Many older people use this.
Exactly. So I think the idea of saying you build the rail, you build the specification, means that the user experience has opportunities for innovation and for fungibility, and therefore you'll see market players on the edge crafting innovative user experiences just to tap into new parts of the market, right? If they're incentivized to do so, which sort of 5x's or 10x's your opportunity to reach more people. And so we see this time after time, not just in identity systems or payment systems, but in mechanisms to share data, right? You can again apply the same multi-channel, multimodal logic. And today, with sort of improvements in AI language models that allow for real-time translation, those capabilities cost even less to sort of put at the edge. But the key is to not over-specify the user experience at the level of the platform or at the level of the first interface, and to create a freedom for others to craft user experiences, chiefly by publishing open APIs to whatever services you're offering as a government department. So if you're able to do that, then people can nest your service or your process into their flows, whatever their flows are, whether it's an app flow, it's an in-person bank branch flow, it's a assisted flow. So I think that diversity is only made possible by the opening up of the infrastructure on the user experience side.
Excellent. Are there questions from the crowd? Hard to see.
There's one there.
We were perfectly clear. I love that.
No notes. No notes.
Go ahead. No.
Can you hear me? Okay, there we go. Hi, I'm John Roberts, Presidential Innovation Fellow at USDA. Rock on. I really like the infrastructure sort of concept because, and I'm going to borrow a metaphor from physical infrastructure, because when we had all that investment the last few years, there was a real struggle with fixing what's broken versus building something that's new and better. And in practice, like particularly at the state and local level, where they're not, getting influxes of cash every year, they're really struggling at the digital infrastructure level with that trade-off, patching our legacy systems, making the critical fixes versus holding some money aside to invest in something that will be more future-proof or future-ready. So I mean that's something that's really felt by a lot of state and local agencies in the programs I work on. I'm wondering if you've seen kind of governments or public institutions at that state local level navigate that sort of fix versus build trade-off, and what are some of the ways or strategies that that can help with that?
No, and I think it's very hard to ask people to throw away their investments. I think there's always a time where you ask the question, is it something you can do incrementally on top of what you have invested? It's an important question to ask. And we come across many countries where we are saying you have a birth, death registry, civil registry already existing. Might be slightly outdated. But how can you make one nudge into the civil registry by converting a birth certificate and death certificate into a verifiable credential, so that it is no more a paper, low trust, fakeable paper. It's actually paper with trust. That's a small incremental things they can do. Actually, you can very nicely layer it. Some places is possible, but some places you are quite outdated in the system. That maybe hard fixing, may be much more expensive, especially if you are locked into a proprietary outdated system where anything you touch there has a higher impact of breaking or cost. Then you're better off actually looking at a new system as well. And India, some of the countries we talk about, or India, we do have that advantage because we are a new player as a new growing economy. Many of the digitization is happening only in the last 20 years or so, except banking. Maybe they started in 90s. But in the US, we do see the systems are even prior, right? 70s, 80s. So they're running in mainframes and so on. I mean, really hard to push and so on. So I think, but that's an interesting question to ask. And we must ask that question. If we can layer it, I would always layer without replacement.
Yeah.
I think it's a very smart way to get a win. And success breeds success. Success instills belief and in the departments and in the team. So I think win and unlocking value for people. If you can get that faster, cheaper, that's a route.
No, and I think
it's not an IT route.
Yeah.
It's a value unlocking route.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what we do. We should not entertain ourselves and create big projects and agile cycles and whiteboards and all the good fun we do. No one cares.
No, and I think just to add to that, I think the rate of technology obsolescence is increasing exponentially, right? So the problem that you sometimes face is, you walk in, you have a legacy system, of course. By the time you decide the architecture for the new system, which can take 6 months, right? You've got to a point where there's new stuff that you should be incorporating. So I think there requires sort of, even in the process of designing a brand new system, if you have to do that and you can't layer, as Pramod said, I think the key is to make sure that you're designing in a modular way so that each individual building block can operate by itself, right? And connects very seamlessly and can be replaced easily by itself. Like you don't want to have an iPhone actually as a system. You want to have like an Android where you can take it apart and take out the battery and put in a new battery from somewhere else, right? In case you need to, not buy a whole new iPhone just because you need a phone. So I think thinking through some of the architecture at the time of recreation to make sure that it's modular will also help it be a little more future-proof than the previous system. Otherwise, you build a big, new, bulky monolith, and then you're stuck with the same problem 3 years from now. Yeah.
I think.
Mark.
Yeah.
No name calling.
It's too many blunt.
I am trying to think of how to phrase this diplomatically. How do you sustain the approach of, for example, I collected all of these from outside. Each of those systems you just described, in theory, depending on your political worldview, are the rightful property of a for-profit entity. So how do you sustain the resistance to the siren's call? For example, right now at the Veterans Administration, they have a system for electronic health records that is several $billion over budget. It's not working. John Tester from Montana is trying to figure out how government procurement regulations work to force them to do something. So how do you all sustain the political will to not fall into that trap, to have that Rails system of standards, open specs, et cetera, because that seems to be the big delta in what you're doing versus what we've seen other folks attempt. Thank you, by the way. You're doing great work.
An excellent point. I think we don't belong to the government, so a lot of us are from the Silicon Valley of India, so down south, Bangalore. So we are independent. We have think tanks, designers, volunteers to build a lot of this. So when we get an opportunity, we ask this question: why are you even building? Point number one. If government doesn't have to build, don't build. But then you ask question, if we don't build, it'll be completely one-sided vendor play. No, I care about interoperability. I care about cost structure, especially when we just can't have high expensive cost because this won't be affordable for people. So if we try to capture the care, what do you actually care about? Then how do you address that care through an open, interoperable design and not necessarily a monolithic system? So sometimes we are really hard on the government departments when we are advising them. We're saying that you are looking at another big, mega, monolithic system. It's exactly the same trap we are falling into. Instead, why don't you say, if you design this architecture open, maybe there's a set of entrepreneurs who would say, I will give you 10 apps on working on top of it. And if a fair competition, if a fair market competition comes up, then instead of monopoly comes up, then you have a price advantage as well, and innovation advantage. Governments, we find inside the government, innovation is almost impossible. Because you have procurement rules, you have to upfront design what the next 5 years is going to be. You don't even know what 1 year from now, what AI or what is going to hit us. So how do you even spec it out? If you can't spec it out, how do you put an RFP? If you can't put an RFP, how do you procure for 5 years, right? So the whole idea of old style procurement of monolithic system seem to need a relook. And we actually advise that by unbundling, your point about unbundling, to ask and say, we do care about interoperability, we care about cost, affordability, and portability of data, the PHR data, personal healthcare data, portability. How do we bring that in without actually writing a monolithic, big software project? How can we do that? If we can do that, do it. Do less. Do less and less and less. And this may not be a good news for IT guys in the government, but maybe that's the right thing to do, right? Yeah.
No, I think if you're in the position where you don't have a choice, you have to revamp it, and you have a big monolith, and there's some money somewhere that has changed hands, and you're not sure where, but it's still in the system. I think one quick and dirty way that we've operated when we're working with countries is to say, the best way is to show an alternative that has a little bit more traction, that's very small. And usually, as Pramod said, the systems that will work are actually very light touch, right? And minimalist and empower others. And so if you can sometimes you can't touch the monolith. Like there's nothing you can really do if there's a baked in vendor contract, they're not listening to open standards. Find a way to build a small, quick win as a tiny pilot in a way that's not a threat to the main system. It's just a pilot that's not really that important, as a distraction. Let it grow, and then once there's an example, then people start to pay attention and say, hey, why aren't we doing more of that? This thing is stuck, right? And so then it generates a way for you to take forward the conversation from theory to practice, right? So a small working Sandbox, even if it's not a pilot means it's sort of real for customers. A sandbox, a test environment, say, hey, in this test environment, it worked really well. We could look at this as an alternative rather than keeping it in the theoretical world. That might be one way forward.
Yeah.
Time
Nothing
is-
like doing one project successfully.
Yeah.
Nothing like it. Yeah, just do one, and that you can write case studies, and a lot of times people do look at it and say, hey, if other department can do it, maybe.
Yeah.
Time is just about to be up. 30 seconds. One thing folks in the audience should take away about digital public infrastructure.
The combinatorial and nonlinear value of reuse is unbelievable, and we are all beneficiaries of that. Internet and GPS and all the public goods humanity created. The reason I can pick up a phone from India, Android phone, on an India telecom, and call you on an iPhone and AT&T or Verizon, is somebody designed a protocol and interoperability, not write the whole monolithic system and say, my platform, everybody is in my platform, right? I think we have seen this before. This movie has been played before, and we have seen success at human scale. I think it is time that we imagine this digital society where citizen-centric design and open digital highways are created, and we see exponential impact subsequently. I think it's an inevitability.
Yeah, I think Pramod covered it, but I would just say, think more. Digital public infrastructure was really born in the United States.
US.
We tell this to everyone we talk to, that the invention of the internet protocols, TCP/IP, SMTP, it's such a shame that we don't have an SMTP for messaging. It's just like a miss, right? But we completely ended up with siloed platforms on messaging, but email is still interoperable, right? So I think go back to the roots, I would say. Go back to the roots of the internet, to the roots of the digital age, and the answers are there. It's not new tech that's the answer. It's actually old approaches. That's the answer.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Kamya,
All
Pramod,
right,
thank
take
you
care.
so much for being here today. Thanks, everybody.